Hello and welcome to Conflict Resolution and Contentment in the Classroom. This is week 8. On week 8 we're going to talk about the problems with the justice system, a little bit about criminal justice programs, an idea of what restorative justice is, the main aspects of restorative justice, some of the goals of restorative justice, critiques for selecting a case in restorative justice, and how restorative justice helps victims, and also the community and restorative justice. So let's review a little bit before I talk about some of the problems with the judicial systems. If we look at conflict resolution theory, some of the aspects is that it's a process of facilitating a peaceful movement towards a social conflict. We also have to have a concern for yourself. You need to be assertive towards yourself to make sure that you have some sort of resolution. And then also you have to have concern for the other person involved with the conflict. So if we look at a crime that's happened to us, say somebody breaks into your house, or maybe they vandalize something in your house, I think that we can still look at conflict resolution theory in this. In other words, the Behavior Act is somebody breaking into your house. Now we also have to look at, what are some of the concerns of what happened when somebody breaks into your house? Some of the things that you're missing. How do you get some sort of resolution for that? And then also the person that breaks into your house, how do you have some sort of compassion or empathy for them so that they can get some sort of resolution for breaking into your house? I know this seems like an odd concept, but I think that conflict resolution can help in this situation. And if we look a little further, I think that we can find problems in our justice system that's going on right now, where if we use maybe some conflict resolution theory, it can help in the process of crimes. And this is something that's called restorative justice. But let's first look at some of the problems with our justice system that we're having and see about if conflict resolution theory can help in these processes. So some of the problems with our justice system is the people that are victims of a crime are often felt confused and angered by what happens once the police have left. So in other words, if your house has been broken into, your apartment or whatnot, when the police come, they have a process that they need to go through, and some of those process they don't really explain to the victims of the families that have had a crime committed against them. And what ends up happening is the police arrive, they may ask you to step into your house, which is a little bit of violation because somebody has already broken into your house. They may ask you odd questions of what happened without giving you any sort of answers that you may need to have. A lot of times, guns may be drawn because since somebody's broken your house, the police have to protect themselves. But when you bring guns into a situation, it can scare family members in the house. And then also, once the person maybe get arrested, there's no questions being answered immediately. So people feel that they've been almost victimized twice. Once by the crime that's happened, and then second, when the police have arrived, questions aren't answered, things aren't happening. Then we also have problems within the justice system that prosecutors, defenders, and judges are frustrated because there's such a backlog of cases that are happening. There's also victims, offenders, their families are fostered by delays. There's a process that happens in the court system where rules and regulations have to be followed. And I'm not saying that the justice system right now is completely wrong. I just think that there's some problems with this. And what ends up happening is we talk about quick trials, but weeks and weeks and weeks go on where lawyers, defense lawyers, judges all get frustrated because there's such a backlog of cases that are going on. Is They get frustrated, and then also the people that want to proceed with the cases are also getting frustrated. So once again, both parties are almost victimized. Now there's also problems with the community. Community members feel that they're helpless. Um, People want to get involved, but how do people get involved? They almost feel that they're helpless because of the process that the justice system is trying to go through, and they can't go in and help with that process. And then also the justice system also feels inadequate because they're limited by power, by finances. How many jail cells they have, how many lawyers they have, how many cases that they can see in a day. These are only some of the problems with the justice system, but I wanted to kind of highlight these because in conflict resolution, we can maybe help with the justice system to help lessen people that are victims to feel that they are a victim several times over. One, by getting victimized by the crime, but also getting victimized by the judicial process. So let's also look at criminal justice programs. When a law is broken or a crime is committed, it is a crime against the state. Uh, it is not seen a crime against a person. So anything that happens as far as with a victim, it's considered a crime against the state compared to a crime against the victim. And we end up getting that criminal penalized through the judicial system instead of getting penalized with the victim themselves. So what I mean by that is if somebody commits a crime and hurts some sort of victim, and they go through the criminal justice programs, and they get committed for, say, domestic abuse or some sort of physical violent crime against somebody. Typically, they end up going to jail. And yes, it does help because that person doesn't have a way to get at the person that's the victim. But it seems like to me that the victim never gets any sort of resolution. Say if a house has been vandalized and it's a crime considered against the state, that person may pay fines or fees for vandalizing the house. But the house is still vandalized. The victim of the vandalization never gets the house repainted from the criminal, or they never get some sort of payment to make sure they fix the house so the victim feels whole. Also, the criminal justice can help a victim feel helpless. We have all these people involved, lawyers, judges, and the victim basically sits there and is quiet. Even in the court system, they typically don't get to speak on what happens to them during the crime. And this goes on with this third point. Usually lawyers or judges do all the talking, and there's no voice for the victim or the offender. So in other words, if there's some sort of crime that happens, when we go through the judicial system, we end up in a court system, and lawyers talk for the victim, and then also lawyers talk for the offender. They talk for them in a language sometimes in the court system that we don't understand. And those two lawyers talk to a judge. And they ended up going and trying the cases. Now, the offender or the person that's the victim never get to talk about it. They are voiceless during these acts. And then also, even though the victim may have some sort of resolution, they may not all have their best interests met. In other words, that even though an offender hurts a victim and ends up going to jail or ends up paying a fine, that victim still has pain and suffering. So I think that we can use conflict resolution in these situations where, one, we can still do a peaceful movement with a victim and somebody that's committed a criminal act. And we can have some sort of resolution for a victim and then also some sort of resolution for the offender. And this is a form of mediation that can combine both the victim and the offender and put them together so they can help resolve the issue that's happened between them. This system is called restorative justice. Restorative justice offers an alternative to our traditional juvenile criminal justice system and harsh school discipline and process. Rather than focusing on a punishment, restorative justice seeks to repair the harm that's done, at best through face-to-face dialogue. Restorative justice results in a consistent base plan that the victim and identified needs in the wake of a crime. This takes many forms, most notably conferencing, victim-offender dialogue, and circle processing. This is something that we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. Now, this application with use, it can prevent both contacts with juvenile justice system and school expulsion and suspension. Restorative justice also holds the potential for victims and their families to have a direct voice in determining just the outcome and reestablish the role of the community and support all parties affected by the crime. So let's look at something that can happen in a school system. Let's take an example of two students, Jim and Steve. Jim is the victim and Steve is the offender. Jim has a locker that he has his prized possession guitar in his locker. Steve ends up finding the combination to Jim's locker and ends up going in and stealing the guitar. He goes to sell it, but in the process of selling it, gets caught selling it. And also in the process, the guitar is damaged. Now, in a situation like this, typically the police are going to step in or the administration of the school is going to step in. And if we go through the restorative, not the restorative, but we go through the judicial system and say the guitar is worth a certain amount of money and it's been damaged, Steve is going to go through the process of a crime in the judicial system where he is going to go through the court system because he's stolen property over a certain amount and has damaged that property being caught. Now, Jim and Steve are probably never going to talk because of the fact that if it goes through the court system, Jim may show up, but usually a lawyer is going to go in and talk about how Steve stole the property. And a lawyer is going to be representative of Steve, and he's probably going to do all the talking and try to defend Steve's actions. Well, if Steve ends up getting, goes through the court system and ends up being found guilty, let's say he ends up getting expelled from school and he ends up maybe even has to do, if he's over 18, maybe he does some sort of jail time. Now, even though Steve gets caught and found guilty, Jim never gets any sort of justice because he never gets the guitar back. And even if he does get the guitar back, he ends up having to pay to get it fixed. And then also this, the feeling of being broken into his locker, he's going to have some trust issues going on. Now, if we were to have a system in our schools with restorative justice, you could have both Steve and Jim maybe get into a room and do some sort of mediation. And the biggest thing that Jim can do in that is have a voice on asking why Steve might have broken into his locker. Also, Steve has a voice in the situation because he can explain some of the reasons why he went in and stole it. So we also have the possibility that both of them can do a peaceful movement with conflict resolution. And then also both of them, the behavior act of the crime of Steve stealing it, they're both of them can have some sort of resolution. Steve can hear problems that it's caused Jim with him stealing his guitar. And then also, Jim can also hear some of the reasons why Steve did what he did. It also gives the opportunity for Steve that has made a mistake to come clean with it. And then also, it can keep him out of the judicial system of having more and more records against him. Also, the one thing that's really powerful in restorative justice is this fact of getting somebody whole again. Now, with restorative justice, how they complete both of them have some sort of resolution towards this conflict is both of them set up a contract on how to make Jim whole again. In other words, instead of Steve going through the court system and having to pay fines, or maybe having to have a system where he may spend a week in jail, Jim and Steve come up with a contract form where maybe Steve pays Jim a certain amount each week in order to fix his guitar. Or Steve can also help in maybe restoring some of the trust on why he broke into his locker. But they end up in the very end doing like a mediation contract on how both of them are going to become whole again. And I think that sometimes the offenders need to hear what happens to the victim so they can understand later on in life what happens to people when they commit crimes against them. So let's go more into this restorative justice. So what is a restorative justice program? It is a form of mediation. It's when a victim and offender meet with a mediator, or they can meet with a group of people to help come together to solve a problem between the two individuals, or to help solve a crime that has been committed between two individuals or a group of individuals. So in the form of mediation is, instead of going through the justice system, what ends up happening is they're going to meet and have some form of mediation between the two people that are involved. Both of them are going to come in and tell both sides of their stories of why things happen. You know, a lot of the times, the biggest thing that I hear with victims is that process of, why did somebody hurt me? Why did somebody do something to me? So this form of mediation can have where the victim can ask the offender why they did something. And then also the offender has some sort of story that can be told of why they've done something. Now in this, we have to also be careful that the victim doesn't get re-victimized by having the offender come in and tell a story or try to re-hurt that person with the story by manipulating them. In mediation, both parties have some sort of voluntary aspect of both of them wanting to be there to resolve a problem. Now, instead of having, similar to the justice system, where when a crime is committed, there's a process and people find punishment to resolve the issue, in restorative justice, the victim and the offender come together to help with the punishment. For example, if somebody is a victim, that offender comes in and maybe a teenager uh, vandalizes their house, they might come together at a contract where the offender comes over and helps repaint um, the part they vandalized in the house. But it's a contract between both of them to help both of them become whole again. There are several parts of this restorative justice program. There can be victor-offender mediation, similar to what I talked about earlier, where two people come together, the offender and the victim, and they talk about what happened with the crime. Now, there also can be conferencing. These are programs that are in school systems where you're going to get two students together, one that's committed the crime and one victim of the crime, and administration or a counselor is going to come in and they're going to conference both of these two where both of their voices can be heard and they can both come together to make some sort of resolution. It is similar to a mediation, but you're going to have 4 or 5 other people that are come together. Now, also parts of this restorative justice is something called circling. This is something that Native Americans have used for centuries, where they come together, sit in a circle, and say if a crime has happened within the community, community leaders get together with the victim and the offenders by sitting in a circle, going through and telling stories of what happened. And then they also can come together similar to the contract and figure out what's the best resolution for the offender, the victim, and the community. Now, another part of this is with the restorative justice program is there's a victim assistant programs where people can go in and a victim's voice can be heard, or if it's a violent crime against them, that some of these programs help counsel some of the victims on getting some of that trust or some of that wholeness back to them. Because we all know that if a victim is hurt in a crime, that there's no trust that can come back to that victim, even though that person may be in jail. I've talked to a lot of people that have been robbed or they've had sexual assaults against them, that throughout life they fight that demon inside of them because they never know why that person that's sitting in jail hurt them. It's by bringing those two people together or getting them some sort of counseling to help them understand why they were a victim of a crime. And then also the offender system, having other offenders that have had similar issues with a crime go in and give that offender some sort of assistance. So they don't go through that judicial system where they sit in jail and then they come out of our judicial system, sometimes worse off, or wanting to come back into society and hurt the person again that's been that put them in jail in the first place. Or they sit in jail and they get sexually abused or physically abused by other cellmates. So one of the parts of this restorative justice is to give the offender some sort of assistance. And then also this restitution part. Some of the biggest part of the restitution is that this payback. It's a form of, when we look at the justice system, we look at restitution as a crime against the state. So somebody that commits a crime is going to pay a fine to the state, not to the individual, or they may spend time in jail. That is their form of payment to society. Wherein restorative justice, that payment goes to the victim itself. Or instead of that person going to jail, they do some sort of help to the victim so they can become whole. And this is this last part, community service. So that instead of a crime against the state, a a offender will go ahead and do some sort of community work in the victim's area to help that heal that community. So some of the main aspects of restorative justice is that all parties involved, the victim and the offender, have to want to participate in this. Okay? Also, there is a part that they want to heal what is broken. So if the healing process goes above and beyond what the crime is committed. So in other words, if somebody comes in and breaks into your house, yes, there's a crime. There's maybe stolen properties. There's maybe damage done to your house. But we need to look further in how does the victim get wholeness or end up getting healed by they have safety in their own house. Their damage that's happened in their house gets replaced, or the materials get replaced. Seek full and direct accountability. This is something that I think is really big because what it does is it gives the offender a way to make sure that they have accountability to what they've done. That there's a reason why they've done something and they own up to what they've done. Also, it has an idea of reuniting what has been divided. A lot of times crimes can create a us versus them. Restorative justice helps reunite the offender and the victim, and to figure out that why the offender is doing what they're doing. So we have an understanding of what their life is like. And then lastly, strengthen the community to prevent further crime. The main goals of restorative justice is the victim is involved in the process and comes out satisfied. Compared to the judicial system, where we usually have a lawyer talk for the victim actually is involved in the process. They have that voice. So that is one of the goals. And then also that they're satisfied with the outcome, that they get restored to wholeness again. The offender understands how their actions affect people and takes responsibility for those effects. So, in other words, the offender understands that what has happened to the victim, their trust has been lost, maybe materials have been stolen, vandalism happens. The offender actually understands how what they have done has affected that victim, and then also they take responsibility for their own actions. There also is an outcome to help repair the harm done and address the reason for what they're going to do in order to make sure that that victim is restored to whole. This is what I was talking about earlier, that it's similar to the form of mediation where there is a contract between a victim and then an offender. At the end, there's a specific plan in order to figure out how to have the victim and the offender come back whole. And then lastly, the victim and offender both get a sense of closure. And that I think is really big because there's a lot of times where a crime is committed and the victim never gets that closure. Once that person goes to jail or they pay fines, they never see that person. They never know what happens. So they need to have some sort of closure in their actions from what has happened to them. Now, there's some sort of critiques for selecting cases to do restorative justice. Not all cases between an offender and a victim are able to go into restorative justice. First of all, there must be identification of the victim. So in other words, we got to have a clear understanding that this is the correct offender and correct victim. Then also, the victim's participation must be voluntary. If we go in and make sure that if we tell the offender, hey, if you go through this mediation process, you are going to have A, B, and C done to help you. No, they need to both come together and both have a voluntary wanting to help resolve the conflict or the crime that's in between the offender and the victim. The offender must accept responsibility for the criminal actions. In other words, the offender must realize that this is what they've done and they're able to own up to the responsibility. If these things aren't happening, what ends up happening is this mediation process or this restorative justice process can fall through. This last part is how restorative justice can help the victim. This is through victim offender mediation. Calls for a focus on harm done, not on the law broken. In other words, in the justice system, what ends up happening is if somebody creates crime A, there's certain things that happen or certain laws that happen, and this person may go to jail for a week or 2 weeks or maybe pay for some sort of fine. But what this does in restorative justice is help the victim focus on what the harm has done for them instead of just what the law has been broken. It also involves helping victims recover what was lost or what was damaged. So in other words, a offender in the judicial system, what ends up happening is they pay fines or they may go to jail. In restorative justice, they pay fines to the victim and try to help restore them, or they try to help restore the damage that's happened to the victim. It also requires holding offender accountability directly to the victim rather than to the state. So in other words, we've talked about the justice system. Crimes are against the state, not against the person. In restorative justice, it's a crime against the victim. So the victim is the one that gets restored to whole. It requires living on offender responsibility in concrete and meaningful ways rather than the message of a punishment sentence. In other words, the offender understands that the victim is going to get returned to whole in a message instead of thinking that if I serve 3 weeks in jail, then that punishment that's happened to me is going to create the victim to being whole. Which we all know that the victim that has had the crime against them is hurting in different ways. And even though they may be happy that that person has gone to jail, in the long run, I think that it doesn't have a meaningful way to help the victim. Also, restorative justice has an idea of helping community. Restorative justice focuses on repairing communities after a crime is committed. So, for example, if somebody breaks into a house in your neighborhood, it has an effect not only on you, but it also has an effect on the community. So, if this person that commits a crime pays a penalty or ends up going to jail for something, there's still the community suffers because people are scared to be in their own houses, wondering what's going to happen. There also is a fundamental need to rebuild this sense of community that is eroded by a crime. In other words, that crime that's committed in a community can separate neighbors, it can separate friendships, because the crime that's happened to the victim sometimes separates the victim from the rest of the community. And the last, sorry, there was a typo there. I apologize about that. But restorative justice takes the perspective that the community owns the problem of the crime and has a responsibility to directly involved in doing it. In other words, that the community itself has a responsibility in the crime. And they have an aspect of the process of healing not only the victim but the community that's involved in that. And that includes the offender himself or herself. So there are many different aspects of conflict resolution that can help. I think restorative justice in our school systems and in our communities can really help our communities. This last journal are, what are some of your thoughts on restorative justice compared to the judicial system? We only have one more week to go, and the last week is going to be on forgiveness. Thank you, and I look forward to you next week.